This is Rick Ball, and you're in the press row.
Welcome to the Press Row. Behind-the-scenes stories from the world of sports media. Press Row. Insight and interviews from around the sports world. Now here's your host, Jonah Siegel.
Jonah here in the press row. Wanted to welcome everybody. Starting again. Jonah here in the press row. Awesome guest today. Longtime NHL play-by-play guy, Rick Ball. He's done the Calgary Flames, the Winnipeg Jets, and the Vancouver Canucks, and he is now the play-by-play voice of the Chicago Blackhawks. Lots of people were sure that he was the heir apparent to the Hockey Night in Canada Leaf gig whenever it becomes open. Maybe that will happen. Highly doubtful now that he's taken an original 6 game. Rick is a preeminent voice in hockey on the broadcast side these days. He's got great vocal cords, if you will, but he really knows the game. He's a fantastic guy. So sit back, relax, and enjoy today's episode of In the Press Row with the voice of the Chicago Blackhawks, Rick Ball. Welcome back in the press row. It is a stunning, and I say stunning, September afternoon here in the Pacific Northwest. It is an Indian summer day. The sun is shining. There is not a cloud in the sky. I am inside taping this podcast with someone whose work I've admired from afar for a long time. I'll introduce him and then I'll speak glowingly of him. How about that? You know him from years calling the Calgary Flames and about to embark on his first season as the play-by-play voice of your Chicago Blackhawks. He is Rick Ball. Rick, how are you?
I'm terrific, Jonah. Thanks for having me on.
It is an honor to have you here with us today. You are, you're probably going to laugh when I say this, but one of the up-and-coming voices of the NHL, if you will. There was a lot of, what's the right word? A lot of excitement with you going to Chicago in my world. People that follow sports media and play-by-play folk, if you will, broadcasters. But at the same time, I'm not going to lie, there was a bit of disappointment that you took the gig because I think a lot of folks were really hoping that you were going to hang on long enough in Calgary that when the Toronto Hockey Night and gig opened up, you'd slide into that, and they view this as you've taken an awesome original 6 gig. So therefore, you're set now for a long time. You would never leave that. So I think that is a tribute to you, by the way, not an insult. But congratulations on taking a phenomenal job and an incredible career thus far.
Thanks, Jonah. Yeah, it's very exciting. I said that I've been interviewed a bunch, obviously, since this all happened. And I said at the time, and I still feel that way now, it's always been one of my favorite cities, if not my very favorite city to visit on the circuit. So an opportunity to get there to live and work and cover an original 6 team with a, potential generational player in Connor Bedard, and work with Darren Pang, who I think is one of the best in the business. You put all those factors together, it was professionally really a no-brainer. Toughest part's leaving Calgary. I love Calgary. It was a terrific place to live for 10 years. Really did become home. So that was difficult. But, everything else professionally made so much sense. It was a fairly easy decision when it finally came down to it in every aspect other than the personal one, which is leaving a great place.
So let's take a step back just for a second. You have a degree from the British Columbia Institute of Technology, which to me just screams NHL play-by-play broadcaster.
Well, it's in broadcast journalism, and it's a diploma, just to be sure. I want to overstate my credentials here and get caught up in some sort of resume padding scandal. It's the last thing I need as I kick off my first year in Chicago. They still do. They've got a terrific broadcast program at BCIT, and especially when I went there, it was the place to go. I mean, there was a time when I would guesstimate 85 to 90% of all sort of broadcasters that people knew in British Columbia went through that program. So it was a great place to learn, and got my foot in the door and got me off and running. Although I did kind of start before that. I I did some part-time work through a series of weird circumstances when I was in high school at a radio station in Kelowna, which is where I grew up. And then ultimately that helped me get into BCIT, which helped me get back into Kelowna on a full-time basis. And, you blink your eyes and here you are 25 or 30 years later and you're in Chicago. It's been quite an interesting journey for sure.
So for those who don't know, Kelowna is perhaps the greatest city in Canada. And you were speaking to a Torontonian. I ended up in Kelowna on a road trip during COVID. I took my kids from Seattle to Barrie through the States, and then on the way back from Barrie back to Seattle through Canada. And our last stop in Canada before crossing the border was in Kelowna. And oh my God, what a hideaway that place is. And I'd heard of it and I heard it was fantastic, but I had never experienced it. And everyone needs to visit Kelowna. What an incredible hideaway that is.
Great place. The Okanagan Valley in its entirety is beautiful. Kelowna's really exploded. I left there in 2000 to go to the coast. And since then, it's probably more than doubled in size. So maybe the secret's out a little bit. But in terms of resort towns, I'm not sure you can beat it, certainly in Canada. It's just a terrific place to live. The climate's great. It's hot in the summertime. There's a beautiful lake. It really was a fantastic place to grow up, although it was, as I mentioned, a little different when I grew up. It might have had 60,000 people. When I was growing up there, it's probably 200,000 now. So the dynamics changed a bit, but a lot of the reasons that I loved it there when I was a kid are still there. So it was a beautiful place to live and grow up for sure. And a good place to cut my teeth in the business. I got a chance to do a lot of different things working in a relatively small town. You can't beat experience, and broadcasting is like a lot of other stuff. You need reps to get comfortable with it. And that's where I got a lot of reps doing a lot of different things. And I wouldn't trade it in for the world.
So you did play-by-play for the Rockets.
Yep.
And then on to CFAX in Vancouver, filling in a little bit for legendary Jim Hewson. And you also did a radio show, I believe, on the Team 1040 in Vancouver. What was that like?
Yeah, it was interesting. I never had any ambitions to be a talk show host, but it kind of happened. So what happened was I actually went to Victoria. CFAX was in Victoria for a few years, a little bit of an intermediate step before I got to Vancouver full time. But I got a gig filling in for Houston on TV doing play-by-play for the Canucks. He was doing national games at the time and the regional show, and there just happened to be one season where he had some conflicts that he couldn't do games for regional broadcasts, and they asked me to fill in, which I did, which got my foot in the door in Vancouver. And at that time, the All Sports radio station was going on the air. So they got interested and convinced me to come over, and I started off as a talk show host. And right away, we got the football rights, so I did BC Lions as well as hosting a show. And then a few years later, when the Canucks rights came over, Shorthouse came with them initially. And then when Houston left full-time to go to Hockey Night in Canada and Shorty went to TV, I started doing hockey as well. But in the interim, I hosted a show. I was a co-host on the morning show for a few years and then had my own show in the middays. It was definitely a challenge. I don't consider myself one of these savants when it comes to sports. I work with a lot of guys who could tell you the starting infield for the 1977 Montreal Expos off the top of their heads. That's not me. I mean, I love sports, but I don't have that kind of a mind. So preparing for a 3-hour show I did by myself without a co-host every day, on top of calling football games on the weekends, was a lot of work, but it was a great experience. Really did teach me a lot about how to put thoughts together and plan a show and have topics to talk about and generate some interest in what's interesting to an audience and what's not. And again, I just put it in the big basket of experiences I've had that, in a little way, each of them has, I think, helped me make a better broadcaster doing play-by-play as well. So yeah, it was definitely a challenge. I had to work hard at it to be even half decent. I'm not sure I was there, but to go on the air every day without collapsing under a tidal wave of flop sweat. I had to put hours and hours of preparation into doing that job. So did that for 3 or 4 years before I went full-time into doing play-by-play, because I was doing hockey and football when the Canucks radio opportunity opened up, and trying to do a talk show and that was basically impossible. So I shifted over to just calling games and left the show behind.
And then you morphed over to the Jets, right? In 2011 for the CBC, it went to do Jets games on Hockey Night.
Yeah, sort of. Yeah, I did. So what happened was when the Atlanta Thrashers left and moved to Winnipeg, I got a call. This was out of the blue, basically a cold call from Hockey Night. They were interested in bringing me on board because they had to, now that they had another Canadian team to cover, they were doing their scheduling and realized they would need an extra crew. Now, it wasn't a full-time gig. I think they only did 6 or 7 games that year, maybe 10. I can't remember off the top of my head. So I didn't move to Winnipeg or anything. I just stayed in Vancouver and continued to do my radio stuff. And then they'd have me fly to wherever to do a Winnipeg Jets game once every couple of weeks. So, but that got my foot in the door on Hockey Night in Canada and doing TV play-by-play again for the first time since those games that I filled in years before for Jim Houston. And, you know, what a phone call that was. I mean, to have an opportunity to call games on the most iconic show in the sport was really a career highlight for me. And, you know, it set the table for when Rogers took over a few years later to provide me an opportunity to hop on board with them. They wanted to put me in Calgary, and that's how I wound up here, because they were looking for somebody to do the job with the Flames, and, you know, meant going full-time to TV. So, and I always loved Calgary as a visiting broadcaster as well. So that was a pretty easy decision to make, but it probably wouldn't have happened had I not had that chance to call games on CBC for a few years.
There's a lot of discussion, perhaps disagreement, about the role of a play-by-play person for the home team. And it's really controversial on Hockey Night, especially if you're not a fan of the Maple Leafs. For those of you listening, not watching, we just got a very big chuckle from Rick, if you couldn't hear it. You know, bias, homerism, cheering, if you will. Where do you fit on the whole, on that topic? You know, how much of it is calling it like you see it, but also understanding who your audience is?
My feeling is you have to call it like you see it, because you're talking to an educated audience, and you lose all credibility if you don't. But when you're calling a regional game, if I'm doing a Flames regional broadcast, I'm talking to 95% Calgary Flame fans. So you have to fire everything through the prism of speaking to Flames fans. Doesn't mean you have to be an over-the-top homer, but you're going to couch things. For example, if the Flames are on the power play and they score a goal, you talk about how terrific the power play is. If they give up a goal in the penalty kill, why did the penalty kill break down? Now, that's not being a homer. That's just catering to the people that are watching your show. So you have to think in those terms when you're calling the game. But if an exciting play happens involving the other team, like, I don't downplay it. Some people do. I don't. I love the sport. So if somebody makes a great play, if they're playing the Kraken, you know, and there's a great play that somebody on Seattle makes, I'm going to acknowledge it, because you're only selling the game, right? But again, you're always talking to Flames fans, so you have to sort of put your approach within those parameters. Now, when you're calling a national game, even if it's with an American team, if it's Vancouver playing Los Angeles, there's lots of Canadian players on the LA Kings. Obviously, they have friends and family up here. Many of those guys play junior hockey in Canadian markets. That has to be dead even. You have to call the game the same way for both teams. So it's a little bit of a balancing act when you switch back and forth between national and regional games. Some people like the over-the-top homer. It's a different approach. I really don't dislike it. It's just not my style. But fans are always going to think the guy calling the game likes the other team better. I find that hilarious. I listen to some of the most impartial broadcasters that I know. And if you go on to any chat forums, or I'm not on social media, but check social media, you'll see the fan bases of both teams hating the guy calling the game because I think they like the other team. And I think if you're making both sides angry, you're probably right down the middle, which is what I try to achieve. So, but it is an interesting dynamic. It's funny how people worry about that stuff. I think most of the guys at this level are real pros, and if you watch it, really, if you're a fan watching without any bias at all, you probably see it that way too.
You've operated in multiple markets, called games for different teams and different fan bases. I'd love to be a fly on the wall. Discussions right now at Amazon as they contemplate doing their first games? Because I would suspect that they have biases and tendencies to think about how the game should be called and what differences they'd like to make. But their games are being called for a Canadian audience. So that audience, as you said, is educated. I think the first game that they have, and maybe you don't know, but I think the first Amazon game on Monday night is Pittsburgh versus Montreal. Those are, the Canadian audience watching that is not a dummy audience. They don't need to be taught what offsides is. If Amazon were broadcasting that in the US, they might. And that's not a slight against Pittsburgh fans in any way, shape, or form. But it's not akin to doing the Seattle Kraken game on game 1, right? Where John Forslund might have to do a little bit of educating to new fans.
Yeah.
If you were the broadcaster for Amazon game 1 and it was Canada, how would you deal with that? Because your bosses probably do have some pre-notions about glowing pucks and things that they want to change and see. But as you said, you have an educated fan base.
I would treat it exactly as a broadcaster, exactly like a Hockey Night in Canada game. I don't think you're catering to an audience that isn't familiar with the sport. So, I think Amazon is going to do a great job. I know a lot of the people that they've hired to do it, and I think it'll be a terrific product. And they've got the resources to pour into it. And I don't think this is just a 2-year deal. I mean, that's what they bought the rights from Sportsnet for. But this is a toe in the water to bigger things, I think, for Amazon. So from my perspective, I based on the people I know that are going to be working on that broadcast, I see the show looking a lot in terms of the way that they approach it with an audience. I don't think they're going to dumb it down at all. It'll be a terrific broadcast. Now, I'm all for innovation. Like, I'd love to see new ideas. And some of them work, some of them don't. You get rid of the ones that don't, you keep the ones that do. There's been, there was a time we didn't have to score on the screen permanently, believe it or not. I mean, so there's a lot of things that have happened that probably when they did happen, people found it distracting and they wound up just becoming a staple at every sports broadcast you ever watch. So if Amazon's willing to experiment with some new ideas, go for it. But only keep the ones that work. So, and that's probably seems obvious, but I'm all for innovation. Like, I think about the Skycam in football. I mean, that's terrific, right? There's something that 20 years ago or whenever didn't exist, and then they bring it in, and it's like, it feels weird if you see a game that doesn't have one. So whatever they wind up doing in terms of their approach to the broadcast, I think will be done well, because, like I said, they've got a lot of people with a ton of experience doing hockey in front of the camera and behind it. I think it'll be a terrific show.
As a play-by-play person, what's your relationship like with the truck, if you will? I mean, I think there's a lot of people who probably assume you get up in the morning, you have your breakfast, you go through your routine, you do your thing. You might go to the game day skate if there is one. You show up, you have your pregame meal at the building, and then you walk up to the booth and you call the game. I'm willing to bet it's not that simple.
Yeah. Well, like, from my perspective, the bulk of my prep is watching games. So this is something Jim Houston said to me a long time ago, and it was great advice. He goes, "You're a play-by-play guy. You're not an insider or a newsbreaker. So you need to call the game and have an understanding of the players on both teams and the ability to call and recognize guys, how they skate, the way they skate, just your ability for name recognition and knowing who's on the ice is the most important thing." So it's when you're doing regional games, it's tricky because you're going like every other night. But say if I'm doing a Flames broadcast of playing, Detroit tomorrow, I'll watch the last 2 Detroit games just to get a real good feel. And then there's the reading all the stories and trying to stay on top of everything and doing your prep with the rosters and notes on each guy and all that stuff. So yeah, there's hours of prep for every broadcast. This idea that you kind of show up an hour before the game and go on the air and then go home and, have an adult beverage and go to bed. You could try it that way, but it wouldn't last very long.
What are you looking for when you watch the game but the night before? What are you looking for?
The biggest thing is, for me, is just instant recognition of numbers and names. And, everybody, that's the one thing people always ask. And every play-by-play guy gets asked the same thing. How do you know everybody's name and number? Well, if you pay attention and watch games, it just kind of through osmosis is in there. You keep your baseline level at about 85% just by paying attention. And then you top it up getting ready for whatever team you're going to wind up doing next, or teams if it's a national game. So, that's the trick. That's one of the, I don't know that there's a secret to it. I do my prep. I have all my rosters for every team laid out on an Excel spreadsheet. I update them throughout the season. I make notes on every player before every game. You only use 10% of what you prep. You just don't know which 10% you're going to need. And just through that process, things stick in your mind. And again, for the play-by-play guy, the biggest thing is knowing who's who, and watching games is the best way to do that. So when a guy's on the ice, sometimes it can be tricky. There's two guys with similar numbers that shoot the same way. You kind of skate the same. And at some of the buildings, especially in the American buildings, you're so far away from the ice, you can get fooled a little bit. But generally speaking, if you do those things and do it often enough, they just kind of stick in there, and, the mistakes hopefully are few.
If you were designing a building, where would you put the broadcast booth?
I would put it exactly where the booth in Montreal is. It's the best location in the league. Calgary's really good too, in the Saddle Dome. It's not a great booth though. It's very crowded, but great spot. You're cantilevered out, so they both have gondolas, right? You're not at the back of the rink. You're kind of hanging off the rafters, kind of at the very front of the second deck. Not too high, but because you're not way at the back, you're 70 or so feet closer to the ice than a lot of these rinks, where you're stuck at the worst possible seat in the house, behind the last row in the upper deck. So I think Montreal's got a terrific location. Calgary does. Vancouver's is really good. Any arena. Detroit's done an unbelievable job with their new building. It's, I think Ken Daniels had a lot of input in how they designed that broadcast booth, and it's a really great place to call a game. This is going to sound self-serving, and it probably is, but it's also true. More people get exposed to the product, if you're a sports team, through television by an order of magnitude than ever see it in the stadium. So if you put your broadcasts in the best position to do the best possible show, you're only improving the impression the vast majority of your fans have of the product you're trying to sell. And I always wonder why, and I know it's costing usually, but you build the rink and you put the broadcasters 3 miles away from the ice, it's just not going to be as good. And it only impacts the impression people have of what you're trying to sell to them. So, again, might sound self-serving, but I think it's 100% true. And the arenas where you're closer and out, away, like in a broadcast gondola, are by far the best ones to call games.
What's it like in Chicago?
It's pretty good. You're high up, but it's not. It cuts down into the. Hard to explain. So it's not a gondola, but it's the broadcast location is sort of carved out of the seats in the upper deck. So you're much closer. Like some of the worst. They're actually great buildings, but some of the worst locations are Pittsburgh, Washington, Jersey. You're just a mile away from the ice surface. Chicago would be between those and, say, an arena like Montreal, but be in the middle of the pack in terms of spots, but certainly, very doable to call a game from there for sure.
See, that's interesting because, in my opinion, buildings are all imitation. And you said Detroit is one of the best, and that's, I think, the newest. Is there a newer building than Detroit?
No, Calgary's will be the newest when it's done in a few years.
But it's not done yet. So I would expect that Detroit, and I haven't been in it, and by all accounts, it's spectacular. So I would imagine Calgary is probably going to have a lot of the best features of Detroit in Calgary. That's typically how it works. Pittsburgh is relatively new. Jersey is, I can't remember. Is Jersey old? I don't remember where Jersey is.
Well, they used to be in the old building. What the heck was it called?
Awful.
I think Pittsburgh, Jersey, Washington.
Washington's old. Washington is old.
Is it that old? Or yeah, but you can see that what buildings were built around the same time.
Right.
I think because Boston and Philly are very similar, and I looked it up, and they were both built within a year of each other, if I'm not mistaken. I might be off a little bit, but they were in the same
But I lived in DC in the early 2000s, and that's the same building that Washington was in then. So it's coming up on 20 years.
So I know for sure Detroit's new building was modeled after the Bell Center in Montreal. And I know the Flames have taken a lot of Montreal and Detroit and incorporated them into their plan. And the biggest thing from a fan's perspective in those buildings is the seating pitch is steep.
Right.
So it gets back to what I was talking about. Even if you're high, because it's a steep pitch, you're not as far back away from the
I understand.
surface.
Yeah, so you're more over it.
You're more over it. Now, so there's really not a bad seat in the house, even if you're in the top row. And I think that's going to be a terrific experience in Calgary for the fans. And I know it is in Detroit and Montreal. Those are some of the best rinks to watch games from a spectator's perspective, too.
How critical is your relationship with your color commentator?
Oh, it's ultra critical, right? I mean, it's like being a defenseman with a partner, right? When I know what that guy or woman is going to do, or can rely on them, and I know they're going to do their job, it just makes your life so much easier, and vice versa, right? Analysts, if they're not worrying about the play-by-play guy missing something, they can just focus on what they have to do. So it's like any partnership or working relationship. The more confidence and experience you have with the person that you're with, it makes everything you do easier for sure. And that goes with you talked earlier, you were asking about the guys in the truck, right? When you work with the producer a lot, you don't, after a while, he gets a sense of what you want, you get a sense of what he wants, and a lot of stuff is unspoken. It just happens because you're so used to each other, and that's a good spot to be in when you find that groove. So with an analyst, same thing. I worked with Kelly for 10 years in Calgary, and a few years before that doing hockey night games, and you don't have to. I know when he's finishing a thought. I'm not wondering, is he done talking? And you just get used to each other's cadence, right? Sometimes you hear guys talking over each other. You're not used to how somebody might wrap up a sentence or a thought. So once you get that sort of as a second nature, as a partnership, things flow and makes the show that much easier.
With the exception of Edmonton, I'm not sure there's a more exciting franchise in the NHL right now than Chicago. How much did that enter into your decision?
It was part of it for sure, right? Now, things ebb and flow, right? Teams are competitive or they're on the upswing and then they're not. So you can't hitch your wagon to that entirely. But having a generational player in Connor Bedard and so many other terrific prospects. I mean, Kyle Davidson's done an unbelievable job there in terms of loading up and filling the pipeline full of young players and high draft picks. Like, I think the future is bright for that franchise, and they'll be better this year too. They've added a lot of experience this year. They're going to actually be one of the older teams in the league, believe it or not. But that will give their young guys a chance to mature a little more in Rockford and play in the minors or stay in junior or college, and not sort of get rushed into the National Hockey League, which I think is the right approach. So I think they'll be more competitive this year for sure, just based on that alone. But long term, they're in a good position right now. They, what have they had? 6 first-round draft picks in the last couple of years, and a bunch more coming up over the next few years that they can either take or use to make trades for existing players. Now it's the old adage of having cap space and draft capital is the best spot to be in when you're rebuilding, and that's exactly where they are. So they do feel a little bit like the Oilers a couple of years ago when they got McDavid, and then they added a few more pieces, and then as McDavid started to bloom into the superstar he is, that didn't take very long. A lot of guys wanted to come and play there just because of him. And I feel like Chicago's on that same trajectory. We'll see how it plays out. But if I'm a Hawks fan, I'm really excited about the future.
So one of the descriptions of Chicago as a hockey market has been that however many fans they have, they're all season ticket holders, that it's, second fiddle, if you will, or plays a backseat to the Bears and the Bulls. You've come from markets that are predominantly led by their hockey team. Is that going to be an adjustment, do you think?
I haven't thought about it in those terms. I mean, there's 10 million people in Chicago. So, even if it's not the number one team in town, it's still a huge amount of fans, I guarantee it. So, I look at that market as a visiting broadcaster, and that building is unbelievable. I spent a lot of time in there in playoffs too. When I was in Vancouver, the 3 consecutive years the Canucks and the Hawks played in the playoffs, and that place was rocking. So, I just look at the amount of Hawk fans that I see around town as I walk around now as a newcomer to Chicago, and people wearing Hawks gear. And it seems to me like there are a lot of them. So, yeah, you're in a market that has two Major League Baseball teams, an NFL team, an NBA team, all the college sports around. It's a different dynamic than it is working in a Canadian market where the NHL team is the number one show in town. And I love the CFL, but there's the curvature of the earth between the NHL and then the Stampeders. So it's a little different for sure, but it's a difference I like. I mean, to be in that kind of a sports environment as a sports fan, on top of being a hockey broadcaster, I find very invigorating. So, it's probably a bit different, but I think there's still tons of Hawk fans, and just on sheer market size alone, I have no doubt that it's going to be a fun gig to sink my teeth into once we get rolling here.
How important, if at all, was it to be going to an original six team?
That was a big factor. Like, the history isn't lost on me, right? This is a team that's going to be 100 years old in 2 years. The Wirtz family has owned the team for decades and decades. There's a lot of history behind it. Some unbelievable players. They've got, that run of 3 cups in 5 years in recent history. So that was a big factor. I mean, you're talking a world-class city, a market of 10 million people, and a franchise that's been there since day one. Pretty tough to turn down.
That's awesome. All right, so take Vancouver, Calgary, and Winnipeg, and now Chicago out of it. Where do you like to go on the road? What are your favorite road cities?
Well, Nashville's always a lot of fun. It's funny, I've done this long enough now that I'm getting a little older. Spending a lot of time at Tootsie's isn't that appealing anymore. I've seen it all, but it's still a great city. I find some more out of the way places now. There's a great place I love called Skulls up near Printers Alley in Nashville. It's a place that Elvis used to hang out at when he would come to Nashville. Kind of more of a jazz bar / restaurant. So that's kind of my speed now. But Nashville's a great city. New York's always been one of my favorite places to go too. I love the energy there. Great restaurants, great music scene. Any place that's a good music scene I find appealing. I'm always looking around to see what I can dig up in terms of finding some live music. So New York's always been high on the list. And some of the hot places, especially being in Calgary as long as I have, it's always been nice to get to, although it doesn't exist anymore, get down to Arizona. But go to the Florida teams in California and just get a little sun in the middle of the season is a nice break. So, Chicago was always at the top of the list for me, but the next two would probably be New York and Nashville.
I've only been to Nashville once, and my experience was you do downtown for a couple of nights, but I actually had more fun in the outskirts as well. I actually thought once you'd done the strip, if you will, twice, there's more colorful, unique, interesting places on the outskirts as well. I had a great time in both, but if I were going back, I'd probably just do the strip once and then spend a couple more nights out near Villanova and other places. I just had a fantastic time in those areas.
Yeah, there's a strip of bars and restaurants near Villanova out that way. I forget what it's called, but it's more where the locals hang out.
Right.
Great live music there too. So, listen, if you haven't been to Nashville, do the strip. It's like going to Vegas. You have to do it. It's really changed since I started going there. And I think the Predators and the arena did a really good job revitalizing that whole downtown core. Like, it was not that safe 30 years ago. And then they get the hockey team build the rink, and that whole area.
And it's right there.
Right on the strip. Yeah. And so it's turned into something, but it's kind of like a miniature Vegas. There's a lot of bachelorette parties. And if you're younger, it's fantastic. But I've been at every honky tonk up and down that strip multiple times. So I've seen it enough that it doesn't appeal to me as much as it might have used to. But it's still a cool place to visit. And like I said, get off the beaten path. There's all sorts of different types of music in Nashville. I mean, clearly country is king, but there's everything there. There's so many great musicians in every genre. You want to find a good jazz club with high-level players, you can find it in Nashville, right? It's not just country and Western. Now, if that's what you like, obviously it's Mecca. But if you're a music fan of any sort, it's a terrific place to visit and do a bit of research. And yeah, get off the beaten path. You'll be pleasantly surprised.
And so you don't have Arizona. So what are your thoughts on Utah?
I've never been to Salt Lake City. I shouldn't say that. I think I've stopped at the airport a couple times on layovers, but I've never spent any time there. Everybody I talk to who's been there loves it. So it's going to be a different dynamic. And, it takes one more warm city out of the circuit. Although if Houston gets in, which is a rumor, then we'll add one back. But yeah, I'm curious to see. It sounds like the fan base there is fired up. So, and the Hawks play there. I'm not doing it. It's ESPN game, I believe. The season opener is in Utah. It's the first ever game, so I'll have a chance to be there to see the first ever Utah NHL game. So that's going to be exciting. But yeah, I don't really have a lot of thoughts other than the guy who owns it is rich and enthusiastic and young on top of it all. So, I think you've got the right guy in charge at the very top in terms of ownership and, not afraid to spend money to make it work. And I think they're going to have a pretty good team as well. They've got a lot of good young pieces in place to be competitive, which helps trying to get off the ground in a new market.
There's talk today, speaking of Houston, that there are internal discussions at the ownership level about adding 2 more teams, with Houston and Atlanta being back on the list. Too early for Arizona because they don't have a building.
Yeah.
What do you think? Too early? Is it ready? What are your thoughts?
You talking about Arizona or ready to
No,
expand
the
generally?
league to expand generally by 2 more teams.
Yeah, I don't know. People talk about watering down the product. I think the hockey's been really good. I mean, the athletes are so great right now, and you've got so many players coming from all over the world. It's truly an international game. So it's I think there's enough talent to support 2 more teams, and if the business model makes sense, and somebody's willing, I'd imagine the expansion fee would be $1 billion. Now, what did Seattle pay? 650? Trying to remember off the top of my head.
Yeah, 650.
Hard to say no to if you're an owner, right? And at the end of the day, it's a business. And those are 2 huge markets. I know Atlanta's failed twice before, but it sounds like they've got, they're going to build a rink, further out, not necessarily right downtown, and maybe more of a area that has more hockey fans. So, it was the huge mistake with Arizona, right? They took the easy money in Glendale, but most of the fans are in Scottsdale, and it was a horrible spot to try and commute to, 41 times a season. So, I hope Atlanta's interested. I think Houston will work. It's, again, such a huge city. I just think it's a no-brainer. And again, you've got ownership that has the means to make it work. And if, I don't have an issue with the expansion. I wouldn't want to go too much more than 34 teams. I think after a while you do wind up with too many, but that's probably max in my mind. But I haven't thought a heck of a lot about it. I think 2 more wouldn't impact the product at all. It's 2 markets that would be great to get into the fold.
Well, I genuinely appreciate you doing this. It's great to see you. I hope you enjoy the rest of your time in Calgary before you head back for what seems like a very long training camp / exhibition season. And then you blink, I guess, and here we go. We buckle up October to late June. And I'm sure you're hoping that you're going to be into late June, early July. He is Rick Ball, formerly the play-by-play voice of the Calgary Flames and now of the Chicago Blackhawks. Very exciting time for you and your family. Could not be happier for everybody involved. And again, I think a tribute to you that there were many people disappointed that you took the gig only because I think they thought you were a natural, I should say, successor when the Leaf gig opens up to the number 1 spot on Hockey Night.
I appreciate that, Jonah. Thanks for the compliments. Listen, sometimes you just got to take what's in front of you. And this was an unbelievable opportunity in a terrific city. I'm thrilled. I can't wait to get started. I think it's going to be a great season for the Blackhawks. And I'm very happy with my decision. As much as it pained me to leave Calgary, chomping at the bit to get going here with the Blackhawks.
Well, they made a fantastic choice, and history is the best predictor of the future, and the mic is in very good hands. Let's leave it at that. And we hope either in the middle of the season or at the end of the season, we can have you back again.
Anytime, Jonah. Just give me a shout, and happy to do it.
There he is, Rick Ball, the voice of your Chicago Blackhawks. Till next time, in the press row. I hope you enjoyed today's episode of In the Press Row with Rick Ball. Hope you learned a lot about him, his history, how he got into the business, why he chose the Blackhawks, and lots more. If you want to appear in the press row or you'd like to advertise on the press row, you can find me at YYZ Sports Media on all your social media platforms. I am on TikTok. I am on Instagram. I am on Twitter for sure. Send me direct messages. Follow me, whatever it is that you like to do. Please subscribe on your social media channels as well. Also where you listen or watch, both on YouTube, Spotify, Apple, whatever, Google. And we will see you next time in the press row. Thanks.